Okay, today we're going to begin studying the book of Leviticus. This is not a popular book to study in today's day and age. I'm not sure when the last time was the book of Leviticus was in vogue. I don't know. I don't know how far back you have to go to find a time when a large number of people, a large number of Christians, really understood or were aware of the content of the book of Leviticus. Anything other than simply saying that's the book with all the weird laws and the weird sacrifices in it. Now, to some degree, this is understandable because we are not bound. This is the core of the law of Moses. And we're going to find out, as I talk about this, that this is the very core of the law of Moses. This is the central part of the writings of Moses, very literally. And it is true that we are not bound by this law today. We do not have to follow this sacrificial system today, or any of these purity laws, or any of the religious festivals and feasts that are outlined and detailed in this book. Those are not binding to us today. They have not been binding on anyone, actually, in almost 2,000 years. And that is true. And so, to that degree, there is some level of understandable reasoning why we have generally ignored this book. And we need to be careful not to take it too seriously for the very reason that we are not, or too literally, I should say, for the very reason that we are not bound by it today. So the laws that are contained within, and all the rules and regulations for the sacrifices and the purity laws and all that, are not binding on us today, and we don't need to bind that on us today. A large part of the New Testament is going to be about the apostles trying to get people, Jewish Christians and then Gentile Christians who came into the church a little bit later, to free their minds, free themselves from considering themselves being bound to this law. That's going to be a central thrust of the writings of Paul, for example. So it is important not to put this law back on top of us today as a binding rule that we must follow today. On the other hand, though, I think, de-emphasizing this book to the degree that we have, I think has done significant damage to our understanding of the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament, really, and in particular the works of Moses. I said before several times already in this video series that if Moses were here today and we asked him what was the most important material, what he considered to be the most important material that he wrote, I believe he would say this is. Okay? I think we put the emphasis on Genesis, but I don't think Moses would. I think Moses would tell you this is the most important material that he wrote. And that if you're going to take anything away from his collection of writings, this is what you take away. I think, and one of the things that also that we don't get because we haven't paid enough attention to it, which harms our overall understanding of the scriptures, is the idea that this is central. Okay, this is, if you look at the first 5 books of Moses, there's 5 of them. So there's an uneven number, an odd number of them, which means it has a middle, which is Leviticus. And even Leviticus is laid out symmetrically. Okay, if you looked at Leviticus from beginning to end, it's got an opening and ending sequence that are parallel to each other, then a middle and beginning and a middle ending sequence that are parallel to each other, and then an inner ending and inner beginning and inner ending sequence that are parallel to each other, and then a middle section, which is in the middle. So you have kind of like, if this were a poetic structure, you'd have basically an A, B, C, and then your middle section, and then C, B, A. Those A's would correspond to each other, the B's would correspond to each other, and the C's would correspond to each other. That's the way the book of Leviticus is laid out, and that's the way the entire writings of Moses are laid out. Genesis is the prologue, Deuteronomy is the epilogue, the first half of Exodus is the next step of history, the second half of Numbers is the step of history before the epilogue, and then from the middle of Exodus all the way through the middle of Numbers you have the tabernacle, basically. And that is the most important thing to Moses, and I believe that if he were here today he would tell you that was the most important part of his writings. We don't think of it that way today. Today we think of Genesis as being the most important, especially Genesis 1. And frankly, I don't think Moses sees it that way. I don't think Moses saw it that way. If we were to ask him today, I don't think he would tell us that, and I don't think God intended for it to be seen that way. This is the most important stuff. Okay, so now yes, it's not binding on us today, but this system of worship, which centers in the tabernacle, is the most. And think of it also just from a shape perspective. Okay, the tabernacle was in the middle of the camp. The tribes of Israel were arranged around the tabernacle, and in the camp, and even in the tabernacle, you had this inner area, this inner room where the Ark of the Covenant was, and on top of the Ark of the Covenant was where God was. So even in the shape of all this, you see kind of like these concentric rings building outwards from the very middle, which is where God is. His presence, the Shekinah, or I don't know how you pronounce it. The Shekinah, 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 I don't know how you pronounce it. I don't speak Hebrew. The glory of God represented on top of the Ark of the Covenant, which is in the middle of the most holy place, the inner room inside the tabernacle, which is in the tabernacle itself is in the middle of the camp of Israel, as they're lined up in formation around it. So the whole idea is that this is the most important part, and it's radiating outwards. This is where God is. The tabernacle is where God is, and everything to do with ministering in front of God and for God and with God radiates out from there. You have the ark. You have the dwelling place of God, the presence of God Himself, the Ark of the Covenant, the most holy place, the tabernacle, which is where the priests were, and then out from there you have the rest of the camp. We don't think of it and this is also one of the things where it gets difficult to read these things straight in order. Like I said, Leviticus itself is divided into mirrors sections. You have an A, B, C section at the beginning, and then a middle part, and then a C, B, A section where the C's, the B's, and the A's correspond to each other. And so it's kind of like a fold-out poster. All right. Where the middle part is the part where it folds, the most important part, and then on the outer edges corresponding to each other are the separate sections. So it's not linear, okay? And again, this is something that's difficult for us because we like to read things in linear fashion. Even today, as I read about these burnt offerings and all these different kinds of offerings, the instructions for these offerings are not given like in how do I say this? In systematic form. Okay, for example, the burnt offering, we can see it in our English Bibles. Okay, there's Leviticus, there's a big dark 1 here, and then on top of that there's a heading saying the burnt offering. If you can see that, and the grain offering there in the next column by number 2. All right, and we have these headings, which are actually normally the headings kind of annoy me. In this section, they're actually pretty helpful because they help us identify where these offerings are talked about. And you'll notice that Leviticus 1 is about the burnt offering, Leviticus 2 is about the grain offering. You skip ahead a couple pages and you'll see they talk about the burnt offering and the grain offering again in Leviticus 6. All right, and there are other places and the other kinds of offerings too. So the instructions for these offerings aren't all arranged in the same place. It's not like how we would arrange things today, where we would put all the instructions in systematic format from top to bottom and put it up on like its own little section or its own little shelf. That's just not how this is. Okay, none of this is written this way. My personal belief. Now, I personally would prefer it to be written more straightforwardly. I'm going to admit. Okay. I'm a straightforward guy. I like things given to me in straightforward fashion. I like to focus on one thing at a time until I've either mastered it or it's done, and then move on to the next thing. That's what I like to do. Okay? This idea of things just kind of constantly circling around. Okay, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the guilt offering, the sin offering, the whatever offering, the fellowship offering, and then you repeat it all again, and then you talk about something else for a while, then you go back like that. That's confusing to me. I think it's confusing to a lot of people. We don't think that way today. I think the reason now, I didn't live in 1446 BC when this information was first being given to these Israelites, and Moses was recording this and instructing the priests and how to do this and all. I didn't live then. Okay, all I can do is try to put myself as best I can with the information and knowledge that I have available about what life was like back then. Kind of put myself as best I can in those people's skin. Try to see the world from their eyes to the best degree that I can, based on what I know about their culture from what I've read. That's all I can do. That's all I can do. I can't actually go back in time and understand and see that world as it existed at the time. I think today we have a very linear focused way of looking at things. We like our instructions and our stories and our timelines given very straightforward from start to finish. One thing to the next, the next, the next, until it's done from A to Z. They didn't necessarily think that way back then. I think it's just a difference in seeing and how they saw the world. As far as the Israelites go, as far as the way God communicated with them, because God communicates with them this way. I think if God were to speak to somebody today and add on to his written canon for the first time in 2,000 years, I think he would speak very differently than he did back then, because we have a very different way of speaking in this culture today. I think God spoke to these Israelites in ways that made sense to them. And we need to understand that and appreciate that, which is why I personally think it's important for us to try to understand things the way they understood them, because then the words of God will make more sense to us. We don't necessarily have to follow. We have the entire revelation of God. Okay, they only had this material here at the beginning. We have all of this. All right, we've seen the unfolding revelation of God play out beyond the time of Moses. We have the rest of the story. And I think it's partially because of that our culture has changed itself around to see history as a line rather than a series of circles. They saw history as a series of circles, and it's represented visually in the way they had their camp arranged around this tent. Okay? We don't necessarily see history that way. We see history as a line. I think it's partially because of the fact that Jesus Christ came along and gave an endpoint to history, and so therefore we see history as progressing towards that endpoint. In other words, history is a line. Moses didn't necessarily have that knowledge. God talks in these texts, these pages, a lot about these ordinances being lasting ordinances for all generations to come. And so Moses didn't see history as an endpoint coming along someday down the road that would end. He just saw this as something that was going to be continuing for all generations to come. When God did not actually intend that. God had an endpoint in mind from the beginning. But Moses doesn't see that. As part of the unfolding revelation of God, he revealed that to other people later on. But at this point in time, Moses doesn't see that happening. I think the reason why, I personally suspect that part of the reason why this material is written this way, it makes it harder for us. It does. To get the full instructions in the burnt offering, we have to skip to several different sections of the text. Okay? It's not all given in one place. We have to go from Leviticus 1 to Leviticus 6, and some of the other offerings have more information that are even scattered elsewhere, even more places than that. And we have to put that all together to fully understand how these offerings worked. I wish it was all contained in one place from start to finish in one location. To me, it'd be easier to understand. I think part of the reason, I suspect part of the reason possibly why God did it this way is because these priests who were supposed to know this stuff were supposed to be fully and totally immersed in it all the time. It wasn't just something they went through from start to finish and were done with. It was something that they engaged in and immersed themselves in constantly on a daily basis, unending throughout their lives. It was supposed to be. We'll find out as we go through the Old Testament that it became a burden to them, and they didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. They didn't uphold their duties the way they were supposed to. But I believe that part of the reason why the material is written this way is precisely so that it wouldn't be a series of instructions that could be followed and finished, but so that it would be something you'd have to concentrate on and immerse and you go over and over again and immerse yourself into and repeat in your head over and over again to make sure. I believe that was part. I don't know this, but I believe that was part of the reason why it's arranged this way. At any rate, it is arranged this way. The book of Leviticus itself is kind of circular in nature, and it is the core of Moses' writings. We do a great disservice to ourselves if we ignore this book, which by and large we have done. And I don't, again, like I said at the beginning of this video, I don't know how far back you have to go in history to find a time, to get to a time when Leviticus was properly taught and understood in the church. I don't know. I don't know how far back you have to go. Ouch, 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 ouch. Ooh, man, my knee. Ow, ow, ooh, hurt. I don't know. I think it's before my time. I don't remember a time where this material was ever properly understood or presented. It might be a little bit more. It might be a little bit. You might be a little bit more likely to find it properly represented in a more traditional denominational church. I grew up in a Lutheran church because a lot of those churches, a lot of those old Catholics or old Protestant denominations that have been around since before the New World was discovered, basically. A lot of them pattern themselves after the Jewish temple system and follow many of the, like for example, Lutheran pastors. I grew up in a Lutheran church. They wear robes. They don't need to. There's no explanation or exhortation anywhere in the New Testament for anybody, any kind of Christian, to wear different kinds of clothes. But the priests did wear special robes, so the Lutheran pastors wear robes. They have an altar. There's nothing in the New Testament saying that we need to build altars, but the Lutheran Church does have an altar and other things like that. And so there is, I think, more. You're probably more likely to find this material properly respected in a more traditional denominational church. I know at GAC, where I've gone for the last almost 20 years now, I think we had one study on Leviticus during that time, and that was about it. Okay, because this is not the sort of thing. When people go to these non-denominational, non-traditional churches, this is the exact sort of thing they're trying to get away from. So you're extremely unlikely to find this material covered in a church like that. I think you're probably not very likely to find it covered in a lot of even traditional denominational churches in this day and age, really, either. But you're probably a bit more likely to find it there because they pattern themselves a little bit more after the old Jewish system, more than the non-denominational churches do today. Anyway, I think I'll start a new video.